there, my name is Suzannah and I am so excited to be your guide here out on this amazing beach. We're here at Ochre at the south side, also known as Constellation Park. And behind me, you can actually see some of the regions that I'm really excited to go out and show you. So we have that apartment region with those pillars. We also have those really large boulders and some eel grass in between there. And finally, we have those little smaller boulders that head out straight into that water. So we're located here out on Ochre, which is actually a part of the Salish Sea, which is named in honor of the Coast Salish people. And I also wanted to talk to you a little bit about what exactly do we wear when we're headed out to the Intertidal. The most important piece of advice I can give you is making sure that you're wearing some closed-toed shoes. So as long as your shoes are closed-toed, they can be your rain boots, maybe you have some hiking boots that are waterproof, those are fine as well. But just making sure that if that water is splashing or if you want to explore out into that water, that is going to be perfect for you. Some extras that you do not necessarily need, but I like to bring, is I like to wear my rain pants, and I also like to wear my rain jacket for that same reason of either getting splashes or anything like that. This just helps keep me protected and warm and dry. All right, so underneath here we find ourselves with the pilings. These are basically underneath that apartment structure that we were just looking at. And as I come out into the water, I'm seeing a lot of this sea lettuce, which looks like this. But what's more exciting for me right now is that I just spotted a hooded nudibranch swimming down there, and I've never seen one here before. And I'm guessing it's because they're very much needing to swim out into that water. And so with this really high tide water that's coming back in, that's where we're seeing that hooded nudibranch being able to exist and swim in this water. Awesome. So here we have the hooded nudibranch in with a little shiny shrimp, if you can see, hanging around. We put them into a glass bowl with a bunch of seawater. We're going to release them right after we take this film. But here we can see that hood part, which is why the name is the hooded nudibranch. So that's kind of what we consider to be the head. And we can see a lot of tentacles located right here. And that's because they capture a lot of that plankton. All right, so now when we look at this piling, which is literally just that structure that's holding up that dock, as we look to the very, very top of this dock, we can see some really, really small barnacles, and that's where we can really see, that's probably where the max water high tide line would be. And those are the animals that can really survive in some of those harsher and drier and hotter conditions. And as we migrate our way down and we look a little bit further, we can see that there's actually some more of those black mussels that are intertwined throughout those barnacles. And as we look even further down, I'm seeing some of these tube worms. So those are just worms that create a little casing and they pop themselves out in order to feed. And as we head on further down, we're seeing that giant barnacle alongside those acorn barnacles and alongside some more of those snails, little tiny snails, as well as little small limpets as well. And as we head further down into the base, at the base level, we might be able to see some more of those tiny crabs or some of those larger decorator crabs and some more anemones that love that water as well. we are at the big boulder area. Let's go ahead and see what we can find. There's also a bunch of tube worms, so what you're noticing is a lot of like worms sticking out, like casings right here, that big lump that's on that wall. And then these are Keyhole Limpets. They're called that because they're like a limpet shape with a hole at the top. And then I'm also noticing some piezasters back there, which is called a purple star. And those guys are also attached back there into that wall, tucked up into there. Alright, so this is the shell of a Keyhole Limpet, and you can see that the name comes from that actual hole at that very top of the Keyhole Limpet. And so the animal would be existing inside here, and their foot would be right on that outside so that they'd be able to attach onto a rock like so. Alright, so as I look at this beautiful rock structure, I'm actually going to look right at that top of that rock structure. And I notice that it's a lot of really small barnacles located up there. And as we head down, we start to notice that it gets much and much greener and have more diversity of animals. So now we're starting to see some of those mussels embedded within the acorn barnacles, which is those really small ones, and also the really large giant barnacles, aptly named because they're larger. And then as we head on down, we start to see some more of those limpets, and then we can head even further down, which would be much more water covered when the tides are coming in, and we'll see some things like the piezasters, so that purple star that we were seeing earlier, and we're also seeing some more of those anemones as we get closer and closer down to that water. So looking at this sea star, sometimes we really want to touch them, and that's perfectly okay. Let's just go ahead and wet one of our fingers, and then using that finger and touching them as gently as we would touch our own eyelash, we're just going to go ahead and touch them really, really gently, anywhere onto their bodies, and just watching if they respond to us. As long as they're looking like they're okay, then we can keep touching them. But just making sure that we keep as gently as possible. Purple ochre stars are really, really cool because they're pulling water in through that large pore that you see at the very top of them, and they're actually pushing that water out through their 2 feet. And so their 2 feet is really what's helping them suction onto those rocks so that they can move around the rocks with those 2 feet, so that they can move and find some clams or mussels, which they like to feed onto. All right, so behind me you see the eel grass habitat. And eel grass kind of reminds me of grass in that it's very long, skinny pieces. And this habitat is really, really important for our herring. And so our herring like to lay eggs inside of that eel grass. And then our salmon, if you remember our salmon, they like to come on over and they like to eat all of those herring eggs. And that's what they eat to nourish themselves and able to grow into larger salmon. And so what's really important is that we do avoid walking directly onto that eelgrass habitat so we can make sure that we're not hurting that eelgrass because our footsteps could potentially harm them. Alrighty, welcome to this other habitat that we have here. I'm going to nickname it the smaller rocks area that really stretches out into the water, as you can see behind me. Let's go ahead and find what we can see over here. These are the sea cucumbers, and sea cucumbers are really interesting because they kind of serve as our mop for the ocean floor. So think about the earthworms and how earthworms also go around and they eat a lot of that soil and they produce this really nutritious meal. These are doing exactly the same thing. They're mopping out that seafloor, all that detritus, because they are detritivores. So here we're seeing a red rock crab, and wow, isn't it quite a sizable crab? We're really seeing a lot of those mouth parts that are moving. In fact, they have 7 different mouth parts, and you can see all of them, including those little antennae that are popping out of there, tasting that water, seeing what's coming on through. And you can also see that this crab is actually tucked up really well underneath that rock. It's actually a little bit hard to find if we were just walking across that rock. And how they did it was they took their back legs and they just scuttled their way in there. So those back legs served as little diggers and dug their way out underneath that rock. So that could be a nice little hiding place for such a large rock. So here we have a pile of kelp that are all attached to this rock. And at first it might be a little unassuming, but when we actually look at it, we start to see a lot of different organisms. Like I see a limpet that's attached right here. I can see some more of these bright green neon eggs. And then when I start to look underneath it, I also know that this kelp is going to keep whatever's underneath it really nice and cool and wet, which is perfect for, as you can see, a lot of organisms. So I'm seeing over there, I'm seeing some crab that's hanging out. You see a little bit of antennae poking up and out. We also see some of these nice anemones that have all curled up their tentacles. And we see a little tiny kelp crab that's just hanging out, scuttling at that bottom. And then looking out over here, we see a wide variety of our barnacles, to some of our limpets again. And again, let's check out this guy. Let's see who this is. It's a hermit crab. So you see a little bit of that hermit crab hanging out there. So I'm going to tuck them back down, up and away, so I can make sure that they're back where they were. And then I'm going to make sure that I keep everybody cool and comforted and covered. This also is going to protect them from any predators so that they are not open for predation. All right, so here we can see a moon snail actually burying themselves, and you can actually see in just comparison to my hands how large this moon snail is. So I think it's one of our largest moon snails here in the Pacific Sound and in the actual whole Salish Sea. And this particular one is quite a big fan of clams. So thinking about our bivalves, those clams, they're able to drill a hole through that clam shell and stick in some stomach acid juices into there and then slurp up all of that clam back into their body because they have such strong tongues and teeth in order to do so. So this is actually what those jingle shells look like. So an example would be these lovely live ones that are here on that rock. And the way that they attach is that they have their foot right coming out through here in this area, and their body would be right into here. And so they would just, if my hand was that rock, they'd be attaching themselves like that in order to keep themselves tucked up against that rock. Here we have a crab molt, and I know that this is a crab molt because first off, if you look at their eyes, you don't see any eyes there. And the other thing that tells that to me is how light it is. It also doesn't smell, and if you just gently touch at the very back, it'll open up, and you can see all that's left is those gill coverings. So those gill coverings are also what they leave behind when they've molted their shells. But the rest of them, just like when you have too tight of pants, like your jeans became way too tight, you just had to take them off, go shopping for some new ones. Well, instead, they get to just grow their whole new shell. So we just came upon this rock that was turned over And so my worry about that is always that there's going to be these animals that are here that actually need to be closer up into that water. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go ahead, and I see that it looks like it was just picked up and tipped over, and I'm going to tip them right back on over. And we want to think about our own homes and whether or not we would want our homes to be tipped on over and would have no more of our homes or shelter back. Same idea here, just thinking about tipping them gently up, and this is actually a little bit large of a rock than I recommend. I think a little bit rock that's like this small, so that you can just check on underneath there and put them back down, so that we're not harming any of those smaller organisms that can get crushed if some rock was to be turned up like this. Thank you so much for joining me here on the beach. I hope you feel so much more inspired after our little bit of a tour out on these different ecotypes that we just explored. And I hope that you will also come out here and explore out here as well.